but I don't know what. Okay, is that good? Okay, great. Okay, so you all have yeshiva backgrounds. Am I correct? Okay, so who is the founder of the Mussar movement? Anyone want to tell me?
Michelle Salanter.
Michelle Salanter. Michelle Lipkin Salanter. Okay. Now, can anyone tell me a story about Rabbi Michelle Salanter? Any one of you? Yeah, go ahead, Dira.
He was going around talking about like the Mussar movement and the where he was speaking, like they sabotaged his like Mar Makomos, and like he had submitted like like a bunch of things for the people to prepare, and then they like switched it all up and like changed it, and then he still gave a shear from what they had given of the sources.
Okay, so that's a great story. That works actually very well for me. So that's really good. Why did people want to mix up his sources?
They were against the Mussar movement.
They were excellent. They were against the Mussar movement, and we'll have to talk about during our 10-week period or so. We'll talk about why they were against it. There was a whole book written by a fellow who wrote the famous work. Rabbi Dov Katz wrote the famous work, 5-volume work on Tnuat Mussar, on the Tnuat Mussar, which is the Mussar movement. He wrote 5 volumes. And he wrote a 6th volume that was never reprinted. It was called Pulmus HaMussar, the people who were against the Mussar movement. But they never reprinted it in 55, 56, 1955, 6 it was printed, but it was never reprinted. I actually have a copy of it because my father, Tzchon owned it. So when he passed away, I inherited it. And it's a very interesting, I don't know how much we'll go into the Mussar, but that's a great story for showing people certainly at the beginning were against the Muslim, which is quite strange. Okay, but I want to add something to your story that maybe you don't know. So let me tell you first a little bit of background. So I heard about Rabbi Yisrael Salanter from my grandfather, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, and he heard about Rabbi Yisrael Salanter from 2 different people who heard from Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. So I'm third in line. I'm not anymore like the 5th or 6th or 7th. I'm the 3rd in line. There were 2 people. One, maybe you're more familiar with than with the other. One was Reb Naftali Amsterdam, who was a student, a very close student of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. He lived in Kovna. And and a second person who you probably never heard of was Meshulam Fishel Bear, who was his father, Rebel Bear, used to have Rabbi Yisrael Salanter at his home. Okay, now Meshulam Fishel Bear was a kid. I mean, he was a teenager probably at the time. And later on, when my grandfather became the rabbi in a small town called Sitivyan, it was a summer town where people used to go to get bungalows. During the winter, it was actually quite empty. Town was very small, maybe 40 families. But during the summer, it filled up because people came to have vacation. And one of the fellows who came, he came from the city, it wasn't the town, city of Rasain, and his name was Meshulam Fishel Bear. And since Rabbi Yisrael Salanter used to stay in his house, he would hear a lot from Rabbi Meshulam Fishel Bear, a lot of stories. And when he was a kid, my grandfather, learning in Slobodka, Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam lived in Kovna. He was a baker in Kovna, which was the capital of Lithuania at the time, and very close to Slobodka. So he heard a few times that Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam spoke about Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. Now, let me go over the story again, okay? Because it sort of will tell you one aspect of who Rabbi Yisrael Salanter was. The story was, as Adira said, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter came to a town to speak. Now, why did he do that? He wanted to push forward the Mussar movement. Right? But in order to push forward the Mussar movement in Lithuania, you had to have one very big condition. You had to be a Lamdan Gadol, a very great Torah scholar. Okay, so he always started off his classes giving out sources. He hung up sources, that day or a day before. He was in whichever town he was going to speak in, and he was going to speak on those sources and impress everybody with his greatness in Talmudic knowledge, his Talmudic depth. Okay, and that's what he did many, many times to many, many towns. And then eventually, from that halachic topic or a lamdanut topic in some Gemara, right, with the commentaries, he would get into the Mussar and talk about that as well. So someone who didn't like him changed the sources and just made up sources, and and Rabbi Shlomo Salanter took the sources that the person on the spot, okay, took the poor source. Let me just get rid of my phones here because I got a whole bunch of them. Sorry about that. So Rabbi Shlomo Salanter got up and he actually said a shiur on sources he had never really produced. No, someone else had written those sources and they were mumble jumble sources. They were from different places in Shas, but they had no connection. And he gave a shiur and it actually made sense. Okay. So I heard from my grandfather that Naftali Amsterdam said the following thing. My grandfather heard it from Naftali. People think Rabbi Shlomo Salanter, when he got up to speak and he saw the sources weren't the ones that he gave, he thought for about 5 minutes. He stood there thinking, and then he gave the shiur. So people think it took him 5 minutes to figure out what to say with those mumble jumble sources. He says they're mistaken. It didn't take him more than a second, but he thought for 5 minutes whether or not this is too much haughtiness to produce a shiur like that in front of everybody. That's what took him 5 minutes. Okay, so first of all, it tells you what kind of great Talmud Chacham Rabbi Shlomo Salanter was, and he was very unusual in his greatness as a Talmud Chacham, which that was a T'nai Kodem L'Maaseh in Lithuania, that's what you had to be. If you wanted to say anything about anything, the first thing they had to know in Lithuania was that you were a Talmud Chacham, a big Talmud Chacham, and a Lamdan. Okay, number two, Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam is basically saying Rabbi Shlomo Salanter was, at that moment, was able to focus on the idea of, wait, if I say a shiur now on this, right, are people going to think that I'm very haughty that I was able to do such a thing? So maybe I shouldn't say on this, and maybe I should just step down. But he decided against it, and he did it. So that really describes Rabbi Shlomo Salanter. On the one hand, being a tremendous, outstanding Talmud Chacham. On the other hand, being, working on his humbleness, which that's part of any person involved in Mussar. So that's a very, very good story. I want to tell another story because maybe that will bring out a different part, something that you're familiar with. I'm not going to probably tell you a story you're not familiar with, even though I do know a few of them. Let me just get the camera a little bit. Okay. So, there's a very famous story that you all heard about Rabbi Shlomo Salanter on Erev Yom Kippur. He's taking a walk to Kol Nidre, right? And he hears a baby crying. Okay? Have you heard this story, by the way? Right? See, a lot of people know the story. He hears a baby crying. He looks in the window. It was near the Shkia because it was right before Kol Nidre. And he was walking to shul to get there to Kol Nidre, and he hears the baby crying, and he looks in the window and he sees a child, a baby crying because the pacifier fell out of its mouth, and there was a child there who was supposed to be watching on the baby, like a 6-year-old child or so, 5-6-year-old, and the parents weren't home. So he went in and he put the pacifier back in the baby's mouth, and then the young girl who was watching the child woke up. She had fallen asleep and she woke up because it got quiet, which a lot of times that does happen. And she didn't want Rabbi Shlomo Salanter to leave because it was getting dark already, and she was a little bit nervous to be there alone. So Rabbi Shlomo Salanter stayed all the way until the mother came home from after Ma'ariv, from after Arvis, after the Ma'ariv service, at least after the Shmoneh Esrei Ma'ariv service. She came home and she finds Rabbi Shlomo Salanter sitting in the house rocking the cradle of the baby. Okay? And she was in a state of shock, of course. And Rabbi Shlomo Salanter excused himself. He told the woman what happened, and then he went on to shul. Of course, students thought maybe he wasn't well and stuff like this. And Rabbi Shlomo Salanter said, I'm certain that this year I'm going to have a complete and total forgiveness of Hashem because I had such a great mitzvah on Yom Kippur that I was able to do chesed for a little child on Yom Kippur. Okay? Now, it almost sounds like Chassidut. It also Chassidus, like, this sounds like a Baal Shem Tov type of story or something. But it is a story about Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. It's a very famous story. What did Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, why did he stay behind and not go to Kol Nidre? What's the message here of the story? Anyone want to take a grab at it? You did, by the way. I didn't get your. Where are you from, Yehudit?
Passaic.
Passaic. Okay, I know Passaic very well. What is your last name, Yehudit?
Friedman.
Friedman. Okay, I got a lot of Friedmans here. Are they all the same family? Okay.
Yeah. Everyone's having to join us from my family.
Okay, great. Okay, so anyway, what is really, if you've heard the story, what really is Rabbi Yisrael Salanter? Why did he stay behind to miss Kol Nidre? And why did he think this was such a great schut that he had the opportunity on Yom Kippur to actually, babysit, which doesn't sound like a very spiritual thing if you think about it, right? What would you guys say about that?
Maybe sometimes the right thing to do, it may be counterintuitive to what you think is supposed to be happening at the time.
Right. What would you think is the right thing to do at that time?
Go to Kol Nidre.
Go to Kol Nidre, right? Why isn't it the right thing to do?
Why is it not the right thing to do?
Because he stayed there. He didn't, he should have said to the little girl, listen, I got to go to Kol Nidre. This happens once a year. I'm really sorry. I'll try to find your mother and send her home or something, right? He didn't do that. And he was actually quite happy he didn't do it.
Because Benad Machavero is
because the act of chesed, correct. The act of chesed is a daraita, and here in Kol Nidre might be a minhag from the time of the Gemara, probably not, but it might be. But it's a minhag. That's all it is. Right? Half of us don't even know, what the heck are we doing there during Kol Nidre? We're not exactly sure what's going on. It sounds very spiritual, and the singing and the chazan. Here's the chazan, like his opening lines and everything, but we don't exactly know what's going on there, right? What is this? Like Hatorah Nedarim, right at the beginning of Yom Kippur. So, of course, that's not the topic of our discussion tonight. But Rabbi Yisrael Salanter understood very well that, and this is very important, in the Mussar movement, they were looking for balance, okay? And part of balance in Judaism is realizing what is important and what is not important. And I'll go one step further. What you may feel is important may not be important. And what you feel is not so important may actually be very important. So you can't go by what your feelings are. You have to go by what the halachic reality is. And for Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, that was second nature. Not because he was a halachist. Okay, we're going to learn. He was a halachist, and many people. But you could be a halachist and also have an imbalance in this as well. Because emotionally, right, everybody can feel, I have to get to shul Kol Nidre at night. There's chesed to do. This is not the time to do chesed. Now it's to go to Kol Nidre. Now it's to think about myself and be a Kol Nidre with the minyan, right? There's an emotional side, and certainly Rabbi Yisrael Salanter was certainly trying to send a message to the family or the mom that even though, it's important for you to be a Kol Nidre, and, moms don't get out so easily to go, to go to shul. But if you want to know the truth, what's most important is to do chesed for a child, right? That's the most important thing. Now, I know it may not be so politically correct to say that, but it is the truth, whether it's politically correct or not. And Rabbi Yisrael Salanter was certainly showing the mom, right? I was here. I had the opportunity to stay home, right? And I didn't go to Kol Nidre, and I have absolutely no problem with it. So Mussar movement, right, was about balance. That was an important thing in the Mussar movement. Okay, well, let's begin. Let's start from the beginning. What does the word Mussar mean?
Rebuke.
Rebuke is one example. Yeah, Shma b'ni Mussar avicha. Right here, my son, the rebuke. Right, right. It says Shma b'ni Mussar avicha. Rav al titosh Torah imecha. The mother is not such a rebuker. She has more Torah. but the father is Mussar Avicha, right? But so one explanation would definitely be rebuke. One, by the way, it can mean also instruction. Mussar, rebuke, is instruction, because you're not really, when you're learning Mussar, you're not really rebuking yourself, but you're instructing yourself, or disciplining yourself, right? Or it could actually mean rebuke as well. But the word Mussar is, of course, not a verb, it's a noun, right? Liyaser is the verb that says, discipline, rebuke, chastise, instruct, right? Why did they pick that word for the Mussar movement, right? And of course, the word is a very old word, right? It's in Mishlei many times, and it's in the Torah, in the verb form, kikayesher yaser ishet beno, when person will, there it says like discipline or chastise or rebuke, right? The child, Cain, right? So too God is rebuking. God rebukes you like a father rebukes a child, right? And there it says yaser, yasreka, right? So the idea over here is Mussar is about self-discipline. It's about self-rebuke. It's about self-instruction, okay? And Yisurin is that from that word. The Malbim already in Mishlei says the word Yisurim, which means what? Yisurim means, when I say I have Yisurim, when somebody has Yisurim, what does it mean?
Like trouble, suffering?
Trouble, sufferings, right? Now, we don't mean here, you see, that's why Mussar got a bad rap, because people said, wait a minute, if Mussar is about trouble and, persecution, and who wants to be part of that? I'd rather join the Hasidic movement. They don't have any of that stuff, right? But what it really means is that when you're going to change, which Mussar, the foundation of Mussar is change. In order to change, number one, you have to sort of instruct yourself, discipline yourself, right? Or even rebuke yourself in a sense. You have to know what's right and what's wrong. I have to come to certain conclusions about myself. I have to be open, right? And Mussar is about that, is my, self-establishing that, I need improvement, right? So, we say, no pain, no gain, right? Lefum Tzara Agra, the Mishnah, the last Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, right? Says Lefum Tzara, according to the pain, the gain. So if there's not going to be in change, there's always going to be pain. And of course, that in itself, today especially, but always, was not such an accepted idea. People don't want to go through pain, right? They don't want to go through pain. And if change means going through pain, then they're going to avoid it, right? Because we try to avoid pain at all costs. Even though, in truth, when we think about it, in order to change and grow, you're going to have pain. To grow physically, children have pain in their legs. They have growth pains, right? And to emotionally and mature and spiritually, you have to go through some pain. There's no question about it. We hope it won't be too much, right? And we don't mean physical pain, of course. In most of these cases, we just mean emotional pain, because change is very difficult. And that's why, by the way, you guys are living in a generation where we try to avoid pain at all costs. I'll just give you one example of a case of physical pain. You may have experienced this. I experienced it a little bit, and my wife goes to a dentist where she experienced it very seriously. So I started on a new dentist about 15 years ago. My old dentist retired. And when he injects something into my mouth to numb it, right, he takes an injection, he puts it in. Now, I know that most people don't like dentists, okay? They really try to avoid them, and that's okay, right? Doctors, dentists, especially dentists, for some reason, people don't love them, right? So my dentist put something first, he put something on the gum so it'll sort of make it easier for the injection to go in, so it'll be less pain. Then he puts it in, okay, and he doesn't pull it out, the injection, until it gets a bit swollen. I don't know if you've experienced this. He leaves it in there, the needle, until it gets swollen. Now, when he pulls it out, it doesn't hurt because it's already swollen, okay? So that's my dentist. My wife's dentist has a television right above you when he's giving you the injection, I don't know if you have a dentist like this, where there's a TV right above the dentist, and you can watch National Geographic or Harry Potter while you're getting that injection, while he's actually drilling. Okay. And I remember one woman told me that she had such a great problem with the dentist that one day she sat down in the chair and the dentist was about to give her the injection. And she said, okay, put on the TV. He says, well, the TV's broken. And she got up off the chair and she said, look, I'll come back another time. Right? We really do try to avoid pain, and the world tries to avoid giving us pain. Right? Now, that basically, in my opinion, has nothing but negative quality to it, because everybody has to go through pain and they will go through pain. And because change is not easy, and change is the foundation really of the Mussar movement. Rabbi Shol used to say it in Yiddish, Severin Abyssal Besser. You change to become a little bit better, right? You're always working on yourself, right? And we've heard that in school all the time. You have to work on yourself. If you're not moving up, you're moving down, so you better move up, right? Shol used to give the example of a bird. Says a bird can fly all over the sky, only if the wings keep flapping. As soon as they stop, he's going down, right? So we always need to keep working, right? And I'm not talking about, working like, getting ahead in one day or in 1 month. It could be slow, continuous work, but change is going to be painful. And by the way, I've seen this many times, okay? You've heard of Rav Shlomo Wolbe? You've heard of Shlomo Wolbe. So you've heard of him, but you didn't see him, correct? None of you saw him, correct? No. So I visited him many times because my mother, and his wife, were first cousins. So he visited very often. He actually lived across the street from Midrash Rachel, the school that I had at one point. So I used to visit him many times. And I once called up for a couple to come for Shalom Bayit. Okay? And Rav Shlomo Wolbe, as you know, was part of the Mussar movement. I was just part of the Mussar movement. He probably was the reason for why the Mussar movement got started after the war, because it was all destroyed. All the yeshivas were destroyed during the war. So he's probably put the Mussar movement back where it's supposed to be, or where it's, mostly where it's supposed to be. Maybe it's not 100% there yet, but he really gave it life again after World War II. Now, Rav Shlomo Wolbe, when I asked him about a couple coming to see him for Shalom Bayit, he says there's no point. It all has to do with midos. It all has to do with character traits. All has to do with people wanting to change their character traits in order to be able to live together. So just tell them that's what needs to be done. They don't have to come to me. So I said, it's not so easy to do. He says, I know it's not so easy to do. That's why a lot of people don't do it. But there's no point in coming to me because it's all mido. In other words, Rav Shlomo Wolbe was trying to tell us that, just to use an example, I'm not really, just an example. Let's say we take Lakewood Yeshiva, right? There's a person learning in the Lakewood Kol, a young couple, right? They got married a couple of years before. He's learning in Lakewood to find Talmud Chacham, and she's, working to help support the Talmud Chacham, right? So if they get divorced, they didn't get divorced because of hashkafic reason. In other words, it's not that she woke up one morning and decided to sing the Israeli national anthem. He couldn't handle it, so he said, listen, let's go to the Beit Din and get divorced. Or he woke up one morning and he said, listen, Chaim is is finishing high school. I don't want him to go to Yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael. I want him to go to Brooklyn College. And his wife says, I'm sorry, we're going to the Beit Din, right? That's not usually what happens. There's no hashkafic differences in most couples in Lakewood. It happens once in a while, but it's quite rare, okay? Why do people get divorced in Lakewood or anywhere else, in the Mir, in Israel, and wherever people are getting divorced in the yeshiva world, which, of course, the statistics are much higher than they were when I went to yeshiva, is because of midot, right? People have different midos. They have different challenges in the midos. Some don't have such great midos. But the bottom line is, you have certain midos that have to change, right? I'm not willing to change. Why? Because it's painful. Okay? That's where we get back to what Mussar is. Mussar is, and that's why it's not so popular, is because in order to change and work on yourself, especially something that is difficult for you. We're not talking here about keeping Shabbos. You know what I mean? Because that's already, that's already passe. We all, maybe later on we'll talk a little about it, but the Michtav Elio or Elio Dessler already talks that, Nekudat HaBechira, everybody knows that piece. Every girl that studied in yeshiva knows the piece, right? So we're not going to go over it, right? That's not the issue. But everybody has midos issues, okay? Different types of midos issues, okay? It doesn't mean that necessarily the person is a terrible person, but for two people to get along, sometimes you have to know how to keep your mouth shut. Sometimes you have to know how to apologize, right? They're all under certain categories of midos, right? The midah of shtika, the midah of apologizing means that I'm mochel al kvodi. I mean, I'm mochel al kaptanut, right? I'm willing to say go, in a sense, put myself down and apologize, right? Sometimes that's all you have to do. But certain people can't apologize, which makes the problem in Shalom Bayit, right? So Shlomo Vogel was definitely correct when he told me it's a matter of midos, and that's what people have to work on. And people don't want to work on it because we're living in a society that avoids working on midos at all costs. This is who I am. I'm not going to change. I can't change. Okay. This is, if you look at certain books from psychologists, this is what they're going to say, right? Avoid at all costs pain. Therefore, I avoid at all costs marriage, because marriage will be painful. Now, a good marriage, of course, will bring a lot of happiness, but people don't want to look at it that way. And therefore, I get many, many couples that will come to see me. Now, I'm not a professional, so of course, I'll send them to professionals, but they'll go to a professional as soon as the professional sees that one of the spouses has a midos problem. All of a sudden, they want to see another person. They don't want to see that person anymore, right? That's avoiding the pain of change, okay?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, question, go ahead.
Do you ever find that it's the opposite, where like someone doesn't speak up enough on their own behalf, or like just takes everything without,
I think you're correct. That's what we call, in Yiddish, we call it the shmata, right? The person who doesn't,
Yeah.
pick up for themselves, right? They're not humble. If they're being stepped on, that's not humbleness. That's shmata, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, and no one's allowed to be a shmata because you were created in the image of God, right? By the way, I want to just say parenthetically that Elisheva's father wrote a very good book on Shalom Bayit. So I guess I'm advertising it, but I've given it to many of my students and it works great. It's a small book, so you don't even get overwhelmed by it. It's like, I don't know, 70, 80 pages. It's really an excellent work written many years ago. I think he updated it in recent years. Table for Two, I think it's called. Am I correct? And in there, he does talk about this. He talks about a woman not being a shmata. A woman has to fend for herself, because if she acts like a shmata, she will be treated like a shmata. The same thing was with a man, right? So if that's what you're referring to, Liba, right? Yes, a person does have to, in other words, if the person is doing nothing wrong but standing up for themselves, right? Basically, what they're saying is, I was created in the image of God. I needed to be treated that way. That's not haughty. If the husband says, you're not a shmata anymore, you're pretty haughty, right? No, that's not it. I'm not a shmata anymore. I realize I'm a creation of God, right? Shmatas are not creation of God. They're usually leftovers from undershirts, So we're talking about a creation of God, right?
Would you say that's a balance to the other thing you just said, or you'd say it's totally separate and like just
what do you mean?
Like the being quiet or being mochel on your kavod or whatever, like, would you say that's a totally separate? Like, I could see how people would take the mochel on the kavod and then like use it and twist it, or like it could also sound like you just be quiet when you're being screamed at,
Right. I think that, your example before is usually an example of somebody that's being treated that way and knows they're being treated that way. It's not a decision. Maybe at the beginning it was a decision not to keep quiet, but they're being, their personality and their humanness is being destroyed. That's not a case of like keeping quiet or apologizing, right? and being, and not, and going beyond your kaptanut or mochel on your kavod, right? Because there you're supposed to apologize. It's not like you don't need to, but a lot of times the husband or the wife should apologize for what they said. So get over it and apologize, right? Because that is going to save your marriage, right? In the case of your case, so it sounds like she's a real tzaddikus, but at the first time or second time, but if the husband is taking advantage of that, or the wife is taking advantage of the husband like that, then they're becoming a shmata. So that's not called mochel al kvodo. That's called not having any kavod. It's sort of like, it's disappearing. And a person created in the image of God, every person needs to feel important. We'll talk about this later on, but every person needs to feel important. The Alter of Slobodka used to say like this. He was the third generation Mussar. He said, if someone could take away from somebody entirely their whole self-respect, they would die. By the way, there was someone who wrote about it in the secular world as well, a very famous Holocaust survivor, Man in Search of Meaning. I don't know if you've heard the book, but there he says in the Holocaust, people used to die in the camps when they had actually lost all their self-respect as a human being. That was the end, basically. And the trick was to keep your self-respect even in the worst possible cases, which of course the concentration camps tested that to the nth degree, right? But a person needs to have kavod. Sometimes they have to be mochel on that kavod, but to get rid of the kavod, chas v'shalom, and that's what a shmata usually, what the spouse is trying to make the person into a shmata, to control them and make them into nothing. We don't want people to feel like nothing, even though I know someone's going to say to me, what about the Navardic Mussar? We'll have to talk about that a little bit later. But just let's get back to what we're saying over. So Mussar does mean work. It does mean discipline, instruction. It does mean, rebuking oneself, and being open to see who you really are. And we'll talk more about that. Rabbi Shlomo Salanta does talk about it. How many of you have studied Rabbi Shlomo Salanta's writings? Okay, so I had a feeling you haven't. And when we talk about the foundations of Mussar, that's part of what we're going to be doing. Okay, now, what was the point of the Mussar movement? All right, now we understand. The point of the Mussar movement was, number one, to have the person focus on changing, becoming, like we said, a better person than they were. The other thing was, of course, a central idea in our work in Mussar is what we call yirat shamayim, is awe of heaven. Okay, that's not such an easy mitzvah, and it is a mitzvah. Hashem al kechatira. You should be in awe of God, your God. It's not such an easy mitzvah to fulfill. We have a lot of mitzvahs, of course. And the question, Kadira?
Sorry. People who don't follow the Mussar movement, how do they how do they complete the mitzvah of Yerushalayim?
Okay, so I don't think you need to follow Mussar movement to be a God-fearing person. Even though maybe Rabbi Shlomo Salanta would have rebuked me for that, but let's be very clear. The Mussar movement started in the mid to late 1800s as a movement. People were studying Mussar before that. I mean, the Shari Chuvas in the Middle Ages, the Orchas Sadiq in the Middle Ages, Chovas Alvavas is even earlier, Right Duties of the Heart, and of course the most famous Mesilat Yesharim is already in the 1600s. So there were people studying these books. The Vilna Gaon said, if Moshe Chaim Luzzatto would have been alive, I would have walked to Italy by foot to greet him after he read the Mesilat Yesharim. Okay, so of course there were people always working on themselves. Rabbi Shlomo Salanta noticed it's a few individuals compared to the nation at large. Most of the people are quite happy the way they are, even though they're not anywhere near perfection, and they're not striving for perfection. They're just happy the way they are, right? And another big word in the Muslim was shleimut. Okay, so there was certainly great tzaddikim, especially, let's say, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Rabbeinu Yonah wrote the Shari Tshuva. They wrote these books that obviously they were God-fearing people. You could see it from the books that they wrote and who they were God-fearing people. but it was not, there was no movement to become that. Individuals grabbed onto the idea. So, and some people became, some people have an easier time with certain mitzvahs than others. There are always women in my school that say they envy woman X, Y, or Z because they just daven very naturally. They daven, they cry to God very naturally, and they can't get up the oomph to be able to daven and like get into it. They're davening, and meanwhile they're thinking about a few other things. They're going through the motions, and they're very jealous of these women who do it naturally. We all have natural things which our neshamas are connected to, right? Which we have an easier time with, and that person has a harder time with something else. Nobody is going to have an easy time completely. Okay, we'll give many examples of this when we see on. Right, you can see the person who's a God-fearing person, but he has other problems if his being God-fearing is not exactly balanced. And we could talk about this. I'll give you an example, which you all know, right? An example of a person that's God-fearing, but it's not balanced. And balance, I said, change, balance, perfection, shleimus, is the Mussar movement's big words, okay? The famous example in the Gemara that a person who's a chassid shota. Everybody was taught about that, right? The famous foolish chassid. What's the case, guys? Do you remember the case? Very relevant to women. Go ahead.
I mean, I don't know if it was for women. I thought there might have been something about waiting a certain amount of time for between meat and milk.
What do you mean?
Like it might have been like a full 6 hours versus like a 5.5. I don't know.
So what's the problem?
That they're just overdoing it for out of ignorance, maybe.
Out of ignorance. So I'm talking about a person who's a God-fearing person who's not ignorant. He doesn't have to be ignorant. The Gemara gives a very interesting case. When I say the case, maybe you'll remind yourself. A man is walking by a river and he sees a woman drowning. You've heard of it? Okay, Gemara in Masechet Sota, sees a woman drowning, and he calls out to her, so to speak, I'd love to save you, but you're not dressed properly. Right? And she drowns. Okay? That's in the Bavli. In the Yerushalmi, they give a case of a child drowning, and the fellow walking by, who's a God-fearing fellow, he's wearing tefillin the whole day because he's God-fearing, right? And he starts taking off his tefillin to jump in, and by the time he takes off his tefillin and jumps in, the child drowns, right? Now, that could be a God-fearing person, and it's almost the proof that he is. He doesn't want to touch a woman who's not dressed properly, right? But there's something warped about his Yiras Shamayim. Am I being clear? In other words, he is God-fearing. He's afraid of touching a woman, right? Who's not dressed properly. Or he's afraid of getting his tefillin wet. God's name is in there, right? Where, according to halacha, of course, you're obligated to jump in and save the woman even if she's not dressed at all, right? It may be not so comfortable for some chassid or a guy from a Shurin, right? But he has to do that according to halacha, right? Or he has to jump in with his tefillin. According to halacha, God's name is going to be erased. So be it. I mean, there's a child drowning, right? There's nothing that takes over koach nefashos of a child or a woman, right? Or anybody, right? So the person is God-fearing, but there's something of an imbalance there. The question is, what is the imbalance over there, right? What is going on over here? Why does the guy think, right? Why does he think that I can't save her? He knows the halacha. All of you know the halacha that pikuach nefesh is docha everything in the Torah. Am I correct that all of you know that? So you don't think that fellow walking past the river knew it? So when you learned that Gemara, or somebody spoke out the Gemara, that's the obvious question you should have asked. I don't understand. He knew the Gemara, so why didn't he just jump in? Right? Because there's something uneven and imbalanced in his Yiras Shamayim. It's a little bit warped. And we're going to have to discuss what that is exactly. And we will. Okay? But what I'm trying to show you is Rabbi Yisrael Salanta is going to speak a lot about being a God-fearing person, because that really leads to everything. But he's going to talk about it in a very balanced way. Okay? Just like the case of the woman that went to Kol Nidre and Rabbi Shlomo stayed behind because he weighed Chesed versus Kol Nidre. And according to Halacha, Chesed completely overtakes Kol Nidre, even on Yom Kippur, right? A woman called me up, probably it was over 20 years ago. She called me up, a woman from the school where I had Midrash Rachel, Balas Tshuva, and she went to a woman's house for Yom Kippur because her husband was taken to the army. And the woman was alone with 3 kids. So the woman begged her to come to help her on Yom Kippur. And the woman called me up from the, right, Erev Yom Kippur, and she said to my student, she said, Rabbi Shurin, I don't think I'm going to be able to go to shul. I'm going to have to tell her that I can't help with the kids because I got to go to shul. So I said, you have to tell her that? He says, yeah, how can I not go to shul Yom Kippur? So I said, very easy. Rabbi Shlomo also didn't go to shul, right? It's pretty easy not to go to shul Yom Kippur, right? In other words, there's a certain balance here. I know emotionally you really want to go to shul, and it means a lot, and that's great. I think that machshava, tova, that you want to go to is great, but is that what I'm supposed to be doing now as a religious Jew, as a Yoreh Shamayim, right? Is that what God wants? It's a lot of times what we want, and Rabbi Shlomo a lot that we wanted to make sure that not only what you want, is that what God wants, okay? And that's what he spoke about Yoreh Shamayim is, I'm going to do what God wants and not what I want, what I feel is important. Because that fellow walked past the river, he felt for that moment, right, that it was more important not to save the woman for that second. He may have changed his mind after she drowned, right? He said, what was I thinking? And the question is really, what was he thinking? And we're going to come up with answers to that question, what he's thinking. Now, the reason why we need answers to the question, even though we don't particularly like that guy at this moment, right? The reason why we have to go is to understand, we're really understanding the human, emotion, the human being, right? Especially the religious human being. Because we have a lot of cases where what we call Yoreh Shamayim sometimes is mishandled or imbalanced, and we wonder about it. Okay, it's we'll find many, even Talmidei Chacham, Rabbi Shlomo said, that have this imbalance, and that's why he developed the Mussar movement to point out to people you don't have it right, even though you call it Yoreh Shamayim, you don't have it right, and that's what we call shleimut, perfection. It's perfection of the mitzvot. Perfect meaning keeping all the mitzvot, not just pick and choose your mitzvot, because you know that there are very popular mitzvot, right? There are such popular mitzvot today, and there's unpopular mitzvot, right? So, working on midot is very unpopular, right? Maybe even Lashon Hara is not so popular, but Shabbos and Kashrut is very, very popular. We're Machmir and Kashrut and Shabbat, and we went from level to level. And like when I was growing up, people didn't even know what the word Chodesh and Yashan means. How many of you don't know what the word Yashan and Chodesh means today? Very few of you. Probably you all know what it means, right? It's on the package in many cases already, that this is flour that's Yashan, or the cereal is Yashan, or whatever have you, and you can't eat the Chadash, right? When I was a teenager, it almost didn't exist, right? I have to tell you something. My grandfather and Ramosha Feinstein made up to be careful about Chodesh and Yashan, but not to tell anybody. See, that's a very interesting thing. We're going to be careful about it. How did I discover that my grandfather was careful? He didn't tell me. I happened to open up, his wife happened to open up the freezer, and I saw tons of packages of flour in the freezer. And I said to my grandfather, Zadie, what's going on? Are you expecting to have a shortage of flour in the next year? So that's when he actually told me, and why did they decide it? Because America gave away all its wheat, all its old wheat to Russia, because Russia had a famine. So they gave away the wheat. So now America only had the new wheat, and that's when the problem started in America, because until then, America has so much wheat, right? Until today, they have tons is not even the word, tons upon tons of wheat, right? But they gave away the old rather than giving away the new, and therefore the gap. Until then, America just kept using its old wheat. And by the way, certain companies still use only old wheat because they feel for their product, the older wheat is better. But that's the way it started. But Ramosha Feinstein and Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky said to themselves, and someone wanted to print something on it, and they didn't let.
Wait, why not?
Why
Is
didn't they let?
Is it not important to eat yashan?
It's important. It's very important. But we always have to know what's the gain and what's the loss. For people, it would have been very hard to do, right? And there are certain heterim in certain instances. Okay, Reb Kiva Eger comes up with it's not a great, Chavetz Chaim brings, I think Reb Kiva Eger comes up with an idea, right? And Hasidim, never were makbar on yashan, I think even till today, so they must have good sources as well, especially in Chutz La'aretz. In Israel, we always were makbar on yashan, the Kodesh, because in Israel, it's definitely a daraita. In Chutz La'aretz is a machloket, whether it's daraita or the Rabbanan, and could be when you have a suffix, maybe you could be making the Rabbanan.
But there's
We're not going to go through the whole parsha right now. You could do it yourself. But the point is, even when you want to be frum, you have to know how to be frum. You can't just go to somebody and tell them. You have to think, okay, what are the ramifications of this, right? And
Ramifications being hardship or like emotional.
it's hardship. And in those days when there was nothing, no products that were yashin, there was nothing that was yashin. That meant that you'd never be able to buy any bread from after Sukkot to all the way to Pesach, right? And that's not so simple to tell a woman who, husband comes home, she's on her 8th kid, and says, look, I'm sorry, you're going to have to bake challah bread every day for the next 6 months. That's not so simple to say, right? So I'm not saying it's wrong, but everything has to be weighed. That's what we call balance. And that's what really the Muslim movement was about. I said it's about balance, it's about change, and it's about perfecting my Yirah Shamayim, right? My Yirah in a way that's very, very balanced. Okay, so let's maybe begin. Oh, how long does this share go for? An hour?
Yeah, until 12:15.
7:50. Oh, 7. Okay, good, great. That's exactly what I need. So let's go on to the first source. Okay. And the first source, we're going to be doing these sources for a couple of weeks, probably next week as well, but let's begin it. And the first source, I want to give you a little bit of background, is the Mesilat Yesharim, which you all know, the path of the just. I actually call it the path of the straight, because the word Yashar is straight, and I have a reason for that, but we won't go into it right now. So I like to call it in English the path of the straight. But you know that they discovered another Mesilas Yesharim. Are you familiar with it? You're not. Okay, this is important. So in this class, by the way, you're going to get a lot of background, because we're talking about foundations, and you're going to get a lot of background to a lot of Svarim that you knew a little bit about, but you didn't know fully about, right? You're going to get more about Rabbi Shol Salanta that you knew a little bit about. You're going to know a lot more about Rabbi Shol Salanta, because you're going to be actually learning some of his ideas as well. We'll get on to other people as well, but certainly Rabbi Shol Salanta, who's the founder of the Muslim movement, you have to find it interesting that you went to yeshiva your whole life, and the teachers never took out a piece for Rabbi Shol Salanta himself that he wrote, right? And we'll talk more about that. That's a very interesting thing that no one ever thought to ask the teacher, okay, founder Muslim Rabbi Shol Salanta, let's read his book. Why are we reading Michtav Shlomo Volbas, Ali Shur, right? And maybe some others, right? But what happened to the first generation, Rabbi Shol Salanta? That's an interesting thing, and we'll talk more about it later on. The Mesilas Yesharim, when the communist regime fell, they opened up the libraries in the Soviet Union that had books that were confiscated for hundreds of years, Jewish books. And somebody found an unbelievable copy of the Mesilas Yesharim, written by Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. I see Elisheva knows about it, right? And what it was the same Mesilas Yesharim, but a different context. What was the context? It was a debate between the chassid and the chacham, the wise person and the pious person, okay? And that's the whole book. It looks exactly like the Mesilas Yesharim, except, I shouldn't say exactly, 95% like the Mesilas Yesharim, except the beginning, which is very worthwhile reading, and we're going to read part of the beginning. Because at the beginning, it's completely different. What is the beginning about? why he wrote this book. Okay, normally we understand. Hold on one second. Let me just turn that off. Okay. Normally we understand that the Mesilas Yesharim was written so we would become greater people, which is true, but it's only half the story. The real reason he wrote it was as a polemic and a debate with people who weren't doing what it says in the Mesilas Yesharim. Who were those people? Interesting enough, they were the Chacham. They were the Talmud Chacham. And the Mesilas Yesharim was trying to get the Talmud Chacham to realize that he's only doing half the Torah, not the whole Torah. Now, this is very important because Rabbi Sol Salanter in the mid-1800s is trying to do exactly the same thing, and I don't think he ever saw this Mesilas Yesharim. But Rabbi Sol Salanter was an ingenious person, and he realized the same thing that Mesilas Yesharim realized 200 years before. So let's begin. That's page Chet, right? Amar HaChassid. Now you'll see, this is going to be completely different Mesilas Yesharim, but it's going to lead into the whole book eventually. Ach, she'ela achat eshal mimcha. The Chassid says to the Chacham, I am going to ask you one question. Hine kol hamitzarach l'shleimut ha'adam. Behold, everything that's needed for perfection of the person, and here he talks about the person perfecting themselves, right? Kvar amarta, you already said a couple of pages before, shurak klal hataryag mitzvos asher nitztavinu b'hem. It's only the 613 mitzvos that we were commanded. Okay, that's what makes a person a perfect person. He keeps all the mitzvot, which I don't have any argument against. No problem. Omnan hataryag mitzvot hineim tsarim hein, but the taryag mitzvos in the Torah are very short, right? In other words, how big is kashrut in the Torah? How many psukim?
I don't know, a few, not too.
Give me the famous pasuk.
Lo tavashal gedi.
Yeah, everybody knows that, right? One pasuk, Lo tavashal gedi b'chalev imo. Right? It's written 3 times in the Torah, and the Gemara learns 3 different things out of it, right? That it's usher to eat, it's usher b'hana'ah, right? It's usher to cook, right? So we know that the Taryag mitzvahs are very short because how much commentary, halachic commentary is on kashrut? You could spend easily 6 months to a year to learn kashrut. Let's say if you want to get smicha. I know that most of you probably are not so interested in that, but the people are getting smicha could spend 6 months to a year easily on just kashrut. In Shulchan Aruch, there's tons of simanim about kashrut, right? Forget even about hilchot shchita, right? But all the other aspects of kashrut, there's tons. You use yourself know that when I cook in a pot, but it's after 24 hours, it's no tein tam lefkam, right? All these rules, right? Tam ki'ikar, and all these different rules that you have in kashrut, right? You can spend a lot of time. He says the mitzvah of the Torah is very short. So he asks the Chacham, it's only one pasuk in the Torah, right? So what takes you so long to learn about all this? The Chacham is sitting, he's a Talmudist, studying Talmud all the time. He says, it's not so much to talk about when it comes to a mitzvah in the Torah. So he answers, the obvious answer. Amar Chacham, a mitzvah eina yoter mitaryag. That's true, it's only 630. Achal kol achat me'em nemar aruka me'eretz mido rechava minayam. But as it says in Eov, right, the Torah is wider, right, than its midah is wider than the whole world and the whole land, right, and more, broad than the sea. Ki haklolim hein k'tzarim atem. Of course, the klal lo savashal gedi b'chalev imo is very short, right? Acha pratim uprate is ram v'olchim. But the individual, the specifics get more and more, as you know, right? In kashrut, there are probably, I'm not going to exaggerate, responsa of different shelot uchuvot, shelos uchuvas farm, like Rav Moshe Feinstein's Igros Moshe, or Rav Shlomo Zalman's or the Chazon Ish, you're talking about easily 100,000 responsa on kashrut, 100,000 different questions and answers on kashrut from. I have no doubt that you can find 100,000. Okay, Asha Elam Gvul Klal is so much as no boundary. Okay, Lule Svarim Kiflayim Bimasha Chubru Klar Aleim Hayu Mechubarim. Even if you doubled all the Svarim that were already published about this, it wouldn't be enough. In other words, there's just so much to talk about every mitzvah. That's the beauty of the oral law, right? The written law could be one pasuk, right? And then you have a whole Masechet Baba Kama on that one or two psukim in Parshas Mishpatim. Amar Achosi, v'lo yishmo az necha ma shepicha medaber. Your ears don't hear what your mouth is speaking. Mitzvah leishei basukah zeklal sheyesh lo kokach pratim. Right? The mitzvah sitting in the sukkah, which we just did, is a mitzvah that has a lot of specifics. There's so many halachot: how to build the sukkah, how to fulfill the sukkah properly, sitting in the sukkah, sleeping in the sukkah, right? Mitzvah that you can't sleep or eat in the sukkah. What you need the rules for all of that, right? So he says there's not even enough room to sort of write how much there is about sukkah. Mitzvah liach tefillin k'moke tzarich lebeuro kolkach halachos v'kolkach piskei dinim. So many psak halachos with regard to tefillin. There's simonim in Orach Chaim and Shulchan Aruch. Mitzvah l'kadosh chadoshim, kiddush hachodesh. Mitzvah niach mezuzah. Even mezuzah has a number of simonim in Shulchan Aruch and many responsa works. You know, how big the room has to be, what has to be written in the mezuzah, how it has to be written. Kol eila elef shelos uchuvas ein dai levarim. You need thousands of responsa to explain them. Mitzvah shekol ma'asecha l'shem shamayim uklal she'ein lo pratim klal she'ein tzarich biyah. Wait a minute. There's a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. V'chol ma'asecha yu l'shem shamayim. Where does that come from? Where's the source for that? All your actions should be for the sake of heaven.
Pirkei Avos.
Pirkei Avos, exactly. And it's brought in Shulchan Aruch. There's a simon in Shulchan Aruch that says, Kol ma'asech yu l'shem shamayim. So the chassid asks the chacham, wait a minute. There's so many halachas with regard to tefillin and sukkah, right? What about the mitzvah d'Rabbanan? All your actions should be for the sake of heaven. Who klal she'ein lo pratim? It's just a klal. It has those specifics. Klal she'ein lo tzarich biyah. It doesn't need to be explained. The first question you ask when you see that all your actions should be for the sake of heaven. Okay, what does that mean? What does it mean for the sake of heaven? What do I have to do to make it for the sake of heaven? This is a klal that everybody goes down to its depth without too much looking into it and not learning too much of it. Vayira ava. This is even better. Now we're talking mitzvah daraita. Being in awe and love. Right? The mitzvah of being in awe of God is loving God. Wait a minute. You have halachas. Do you have halachas in for Shabbos? You have halachas for Shabbos, right? It's a mitzvah, right? You have a lot of halachas. You have halachas for eating matzah on Pesach. A lot of halachas, right? What about the mitzvah of v'yaresim elokecha as Hashem elokecha tira? After Hashem elokecha yira and ava. Have you ever read any halachas on that? How you fulfill those mitzvahs? Have you ever seen any halachas on it? So the Mesil Sisharim says to the Chacham, how come you didn't study the halachas about that? How to be a God-fearing person? Is it so easy to be God-fearing? It's so hard to shake a lulav so you have thousands of response on it, and it's so easy to be God-fearing and love God. Loving God is so easy that you don't even have to talk about it. You just have to tell me, go love God. Puff! Now I love God, because Rabbi Shurin said, love God, right? Or the Torah.
Is there no Gemara on it?
What?
Are there no
There are Gemaras about it, right? But has anything been codified? Not really. So the Mesil Yisharim asks the Chacham, you're spending time. What about it? You said You said you spent time on all the mitzvahs. What about this mitzvah? What happened to this? And of course, we're going to see what the Chacham says next week. Be well, guys. Looking forward.
Thank you
Any
so
other
much.
questions? Quickly, any other questions? Great. We'll talk about it next week.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.